Warning. This episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Give us 1 hour and we'll help you change the way you think about happiness. Harvesting Happiness with Lisa Cypers Kamen is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. Each week, Lisa spotlights diverse trendsetters and change agents who are the greatest contemporary thinkers and doers, devoting their lives to creating a better world in which to live. Your host, Lisa Cypers Kamen, is a widely recognized applied positive psychology expert, author, documentary filmmaker, and lecturer specializing in optimal lifestyle management. Let's get to it. Here's Lisa.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us on today's show, where you will learn how to winterize your health, preventing and managing colds, COVID, and more. My first guest is Dr. Aaron Hartman. Dr. Hartman has been involved with more than 60 clinical studies. He's a board-certified Integrative and Functional Medicine doctor, along with holding a family practice. Dr. Hartman is the founder of the Virginia Research Center and serves as an assistant clinical professor of family medicine at the VCU School of Medicine. In 2016, he founded Richmond Integrative and Functional Medicine, and he's in the house to talk about how we can protect our immune systems, our bodies, and take care of our overall health and prevent the cooties from getting to us. Welcome, Aaron. Thanks for joining us on the show.
It's great to be here. I'm happy to be here and just have a lively discussion.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we've got a lot of material to cover in a short period of time. You and I had a conversation offline about COVID and cooties in general, and I know that you've got a lot of thoughts about that I want you to share with the audience. But before we do, I want you to set up this scenario of what truly effective integrative and functional medicine looks like for healthcare protection and not just treating disease when it arises.
I mean, I think you look at, we talk about preventive healthcare all the time, but we don't actually talk about what that requires. There's some foundational things that are critically important. Diet is a huge part of that. The current literature shows that half of all chronic disease in our country can be directly attributed to eating processed foods. That's a huge, huge point to think about. When we think about your immune system and you realize that 90% of your immune system is around your GI tract, all of a sudden the processed foods, the chemicals, or the nutrient-dense foods are going to be either modulating that or agitating that whole immune system. Sleep is huge. Sleeping between 6 and 8 hours a night can increase your risk for significant upper respiratory tract infections during flu season, 40 to 60%. This is a whole host of basic things. Your environment, when I talk with patients, we talk about their environment. Is there water damage in their house? Is there mold in the house? Do they have carpets everywhere? Do they have pets? If you have a lot of particulates in the air where you live, you're going to get a low-grade inflammation in your sinuses and your lungs that increases your risk for a whole host of diseases, including respiratory tract infections. So we just kind of talk about the basics for prevention, develop an individualized plan, and then kind of go from there.
So what I hear you saying is that health hygiene is really the best course that we can take to prevent all disease.
I mean, absolutely. And you got to think about, root cause, not just the root cause for illness, but the root cause for health. Health does not happen accidentally, just like disease doesn't. And if you have a intentional lifestyle that is thinking about clean water, clean food, clean air, clean environment, sleep, appropriate rest, adequate fluid intake, these are all things that set your body up so that when you do get an attack of whatever, that your body's ready to respond in a measured way. And that's part of the issue with severe COVID, for example. We realize that people with non-diverse gut bacteria, it's called the microbiome is the fancy word for that, which happens in the elderly, are more prone to serious COVID. That's one of the reasons why kids have less severe COVID is because they have a more diverse bacteria in their gut. Well, the primary driver for that is our diet. So all of a sudden, there's things we can address that set people up for resilience. And that's one of the things I'll focus on, in my clinic and online and the communities we do is how do you build resilience so that when the trials of life occur, you'll sail through.
Hang on one second. I want to go back to the point about the contrast between elderly people being more at risk for diseases like COVID versus children being less so. I take care of a 96-year-old, and I know that her diet has a lot of soft food. It doesn't have a lot of fresh leafy green vegetables. It's not nutrient diverse. because she has a whole host of other issues, right? That when she does eat those foods, she has gastrointestinal distress. So it's a catch-22, right?
Well, it is, but it depends. Also, once you realize that people over 80, their stomach makes less stomach acid and they make less digestive enzymes. And so a lot of times when people are older and they have food reactivities, it's because they're not digesting it appropriately. So they have to eat these partially digested food, mashes or whatnot, not partially because they're older, but also it's partially because they don't make enough stomach acid and they don't make enough digestive enzymes. But that's where you can use things. You can use digestive enzymes. You can use nutritional grade supplements to aid in the digestion.
Right. So you're not depriving them of the solid nutrition they need to keep their immune system strong and their body operating optimally as we age.
Correct. Yeah. And sometimes that means cooking the food. Like you can't do raw spinach, but you can do sauteed spinach, because you help that digestive process before it actually goes in your mouth.
So let's talk a little bit about prevention of the common cooties, from the cold to COVID. What's a good baseline, a good place to start when we say, all right, we're heading into winter. What are these things that we can do to try and bulletproof ourselves?
Well, I think there's the lifestyle things, then there's the dietary supplement things. The lifestyle things are, diet, exercise, sleep, all the typical things. One thing people don't think about is air quality. Half the buildings in the country have some kind of water damage, and when it's really dry in the wintertime, you get more particulates in the air. So something as simple as a HEPA filter to actually help clean the air so you're getting less inflammation in your respiratory tract is a big deal. And now that's kind of catching on with all the COVID stuff. Diet's huge, sleep is huge. And then you go into the nutritional stuff. There's a whole host of data on, vitamin D, for example. 87% of people who die with COVID have low vitamin D levels. It's an important nutrient for your body to make antibodies to fight off infections.
It's interesting. I was talking about vitamin D with my doctor. I had recently gone for my annual physical, and I said, will you run a blood test for vitamin D? She goes, oh, well, we don't even run it anymore. We just assume everybody's deficient and we ask them to take it.
Yeah. The thing about that is do you need 2,000 units to get your level up, or do you need 10,000? How much do you need to optimize your D, not just normalize? And so when you look at the D range, and this is where functional medicine comes into play, average D level is the normal is 30 to 100, right? The optimal is 60 to 80. If your D is less than 48, you still have an increased risk of developing asthma, allergies, and infections. So do you want your level barely normal at 30 or 32, or do you want optimal between 60 and 80? And the only way to really know that is to test it, then take a supplement, and then retest it to make sure you're not overshooting that. And I don't know why we can't do that, because that seems like personalized, individualized healthcare, right?
Right. Well, you know why we can't do that.
I know, it's rhetorical, I know.
Yeah, the listeners know why we can't do that. Come on. But we're not talking about that today. So, vitamin D. What about other very simple supplementation or ways to keep ourselves safe and healthy?
There's probably 4 key nutrients. D is at the top of the list. Vitamin C is a huge one. When you get sick, your body's needs for vitamin C skyrocket from a couple hundred milligrams a day to several thousand a day. So just having that on board and ready is huge. Zinc. 40% of the population is zinc deficient, and zinc is an important nutrient for your body's ability to fight off viruses. Doing 30 to 50 milligrams a day of that is huge. And then you get into all these lesser kind of things like N-acetylcysteine or NAC, which is one of my favorite nutrients.
Say that again?
N-acetylcysteine or NAC. It's also called NAC. It actually turns into glutathione in your body, which is your body's primary intracellular antioxidant. And there's all kinds of data with it lowering your risk for respiratory tract infections. In the hospital, they use an inhaled version of this called Mucomist to treat serious infections, people with cystic fibrosis. Well, you can take an oral version from a supplement daily to help to do similar effects to your lungs and your immune system. And there's great data on that as well as having antiviral activity. And so those are kind of like my top 4 nutrients. And I got my second tier and my third tier, but there are a lot of things like that you can do to help with your basic immune system.
And what about just the basics of, hand washing, masks? And I'm going to go into a territory that maybe is controversial. I don't know. But what about just those basic things?
Those go without saying. Like obviously, hand washing is huge.
No. If you've got little boys running around the house,
well, in that case, it goes without saying they're probably not going to do it, right? But yeah, hand washing is huge. That's one of the major, health inventions, quote unquote, washing your hands. Ignaz Semmelweis lost his career over that in the 1800s because he said, hey, wash your hands before doing autopsies on bodies in the basement and delivering babies. And it revolutionized healthcare 30 years later. I mean, that's still a big deal today. And masks are huge because they help me. Where's flu been for the last 2 years? Flu's been pretty much non-existent, largely because of mask wearing. Yes, social distancing, but the mask wearing has been the big thing. It's had a massive impact on the infectability or spreadability of influenza for the last 2, potentially this season, 3rd year.
I have a question about masks and myths because I have family members who tell me that masks cause carbon monoxide poisoning. And I did some research online and found what I found was not to be true, that is incorrect. But maybe we can share a little bit about this myth busting with our audience.
I mean, if that was true, then the neurosurgeons who do 12 and 14-hour surgical procedures with a mask on would pass out, in the first hour of surgery, right? So just from a pragmatic standpoint, that's not the way it works. But there's a thing called the diffusion coefficient, and that is how quickly carbon dioxide goes across the membrane. And its diffusion coefficient is so robust that it transmits across membrane so quickly that oxygen, which has a much less diffusion coefficient, has no problem going through a mask. So what that means is if you can get oxygen through the mask, all the CO2 is going through, right? Based on just basic physics. So the thing about it is if you're getting oxygen through the mask, the CO2 is going through as well.
Thank you, Dr. Hartman. I mean, this has been on my mind because you find all kinds of stuff online, studies that really aren't studies, and chiropractors who are talking about mask wearing and that are sudden epidemiologists, when that's not their purview. So this is what I think a lot of people are trying to suss out online. And I know that you've got a lot of opinions on that. I mean, even you trying to post research that you're making that is valuable, valid research is having a hard time being seen out there in the world because nobody knows what to believe.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. When information's become so readily available, it's almost kind of the quality is cheapened. It's like when you have to go to a library to get a book, that means someone has looked and ferreted a bunch of books, and then there's editors in the book. It takes 5 to 8 years to make a book, but usually by the time you get that in your hands, it's gone through this whole filtration system. And even then there's errors in books, right? I mean, all the books aren't perfect. You just removed all that and given people access to the Wild West. And I mean, yes, that's kind of what it is.
True.
And so anywhere from the, you get, high carbon dioxide brain poisoning from wearing a mask to, who knows what. It's just, I tell people, I hear Elvis is still alive. Elvis is not dead, right? They got proof of it. We didn't land on the moon. We got video showing that it was actually faked, right, in a TV station in California. There's stuff about that still out there, and there are people who still would hold to that. And I just, when you realize there's a wide range of this, you have to just kind of find reliable sources and stick with them. Because again, it's unless you become your own expert in the field, which has taken me 20 some years, it's hard.
Well, and this is a reliable source. Dr. Aaron Hartman, MD, MAR, FAAFP, and so on and so on. The man has more credentials than most of us would read after our names. I just want to say that. We're going to take a pause and then we'll come back and we will continue the conversation with Dr. Aaron Hartman. To learn more about his work and functional medicine, please go to richmondfunctionalmedicine.com. On Twitter, he's at Aaron Hartman, MD. On Facebook and Instagram, those handles are RVA Integrative. We'll be right back.
To learn more about cultivating sustainable well-being at home and the office, visit harvestinghappiness.com and explore Lisa's experiential on-site brain fitness workshops, corporate programming, and speaking engagement services.
And we're back talking about winterizing our health, preventing and managing colds, COVID, and more. Let's get back to the conversation with my guest, Dr. Aaron Hartman. Okay, Aaron, let's go back to COVID and let's talk about long COVID or long haulers. My father is one of them. I shared that with you. And so I know a little bit about what he's going through. And I would love your take on how to support a patient who is going through an extended recovery from COVID.
Yeah. And for me, it just depends on when I see them in that recovery. Is it in their acute, post-acute, when they're like a couple weeks out and their blood markers are still off? Is it 12 weeks out when they're like no longer in the acute or post-acute? It's chronic. It just really depends. So what I'm just saying here is just general kind of recommendations. I mean, the first thing you want to do is you look at the person's nutritional status. Nutrient deficiencies are a huge cause for immune dysregulation. Vitamin D being the biggest one, zinc, selenium, copper, manganese, B vitamins, B12, folic acid. So I do a nutritional status evaluation on the patient. A lot of people don't realize that the fatty acids in your system, like things like omega-3s and omega-6s, actually help modulate your immune system. And I routinely see people who have deficiencies in these. So I just do like a comprehensive nutritional evaluation. Then I look at the patient's past, like what sets you up for this post-acute inflammatory syndrome. I tell people about long COVID. It's very similar to post-Lyme or long Lyme, very similar to the chronic fatigue from a mono infection or CMV infection. We have many examples of post-infectious inflammatory syndromes. It's just what's unique with this one is the COVID being the trigger. So I look at people's past, and that's where mold becomes a big player. Are you in a moldy house? Do you have a lot of dust and particulates, which gave you low-grade lung inflammation? Sleep apnea. I'm seeing tons of undiagnosed sleep apnea in these patients. Your gut health I mentioned.
Yes.
If you have inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel, IBS, SIBO, these are all digestive issues, and you have to realize that 80 to 90% of your immune system is around your GI tract. So all of a sudden, GI health helps set you up for either a resilient immune system or makes you more inflamed. So I kind of start with like that basic, what I call the foundational evaluation of like what kind of sets you up for this. The trigger we know about. Then what's keeping you there? Why are you staying in this inflammatory phase? And so I see some patients who are hypermobile or double jointed, for example, which makes you great at sports, great at a lot of things, but it also makes you more inflamed. It makes you have a higher need for vitamin C, trace minerals, and the like. Huh. And so I look at, this is personalized medicine, right?
Didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, a lot of these people also have low grade sleep apnea. I use the example of, Michael Phelps. Everybody kind of has a picture of him in their head, like he can dislocate his shoulder. That picture. He's an amazing athlete, but also the facial features where his head's kind of long, his teeth are small for his mouth. Like that's like the typical setup for someone who has a upper airway resistance syndrome, which is a athletic sleep apnea. And so we look for all these things, and it's kind of like, what other things are there data for, that can help lower your immune system? And we know from the data that long COVID is a mast cell activation syndrome. So what does that mean? That means things like antihistamines, like H1, H2 blockers, loratadine, Zyrtec, Pepcid can help lower the inflammation. And we know from the literature that if you're on Pepcid, when you get COVID, it lowers your risk of hospitalization 40%.
Wow.
So we know things like that can lower that, checking the D, et cetera, C. There are minerals and nutrients like resveratrol. There's a bunch of controversy about hydroxychloroquine back in the day.
Yes.
Well, one of the things the way hydroxychloroquine is supposed to work is as an ionophore that helps get zinc into your cells. Well, if your zinc is low, it doesn't work. So that's the reason why some of the literature is kind of mixed. But resveratrol and quercetin do the same thing. And these also are nutrients that affect this thing called the inflammasome, which is these little parts of your immune system that modulates inflammation. Using resveratrol and quercetin can help modulate that. And quercetin, which is a apple extract, is also a mast cell stabilizer. So I start kind of piecing things together with patients. There's all kinds of data about things like low-dose naltrexone, for example. There's actually been studies looking at it in long COVID patients showing symptom reduction. So I start applying these therapeutics. And then there's a lot of different engineering research from Dr. Patterson's group looking at different antivirals being used for long COVID, like Mavaroc, which is kind of interesting because now, as of a week ago, it looks like Merck and Pfizer are both going to have antivirals approved to treat acute COVID, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's just reaching your hands out to all this literature and saying, what are the leverage points I can use for people's health that are at least as safe as the conventional care, and then discussing this with these patients and then applying in a stepwise progress and seeing how people are doing.
My head is spinning because, first of all, I love quercetin. It is like the best natural antihistamine one could ever imagine, right? It's cheap, it's harmless, and it works. I
used to get bronchitis every spring and fall.
Yep.
And then when I realized, hey, it's allergies and a little mold, a little this, that, I started doing curcumin and quercetin about 6 weeks before allergy season, and I haven't had bronchitis in 8 years. I mean, it's great stuff.
It is great stuff. Well, this is great information. And, we could go on and on and on about this. And I want to just hit on one area about long hauler or long COVID being also how it affects the neurological system. Yeah. Because I think that's an area that people, it's underreported or underdiscussed.
Yeah. Well, think about, I look back at the past to see what has happened in the past to help inform the present and the future. And that's one of the things we talked about science before. Like science, people think science is this concrete thing. Science is like a moving river. The river looks the same, but you never put your toe in the same river twice. And when you realize that half of all published clinical trials or later the findings are later found to be false, you have to use your experience to interpret this stuff. And so back, how do I apply that? Back in 1918, 1920, about 8 years after Spanish influenza went around, we saw an uptick in Parkinson's disease. When the Russian flu came around Russia, late 1800s, same kind of thing, these neurological degradation stuff. And mid to late August out of Europe, some literature started coming out showing gray matter atrophy or decrease in people with COVID. And so, there's not only like the loss of brain stuff, there's also this, what I call a COVID brain, where you get COVID and it puts you in the sympathetic overdrive. And so you're anxious, you're kind of irritable, you're kind of in this sense of like heightened awareness, you frighten easy, you can't tolerate stuff. There's that aspect. So there's the psychological limbic aspect of COVID. Then there's the neurological aspect of COVID. And those are the things that concern me. What are we going to be looking at 8 years from now? And this is the reason why when I see people, I do testing for inflammatory markers and I try to lower the inflammation, because it's just like the concussion literature. You get a concussion and you don't lower the inflammation, you can get a thing called chronic traumatic encephalopathy 20, 30 years later.
Wow. This is a lot to think about, a lot to digest, and a lot that we can do. And I think for me, the great part of having conversations like this is that we realize that we can take command of our health, that we can have a big impact upon our long-term health, short-term health, and the health of our families. And I would love for you to, if you feel like you want to, talk a little bit about your kids and how you have really prevented them from having to take antibiotics. I think you said one course?
Yeah, so we adopted all of our kids. They all came from different difficult situations. We got one when they were 2 years old, one when they were 1, and one when they were 6 months old. And my son, for example, had bad asthma and eczema when we got him when he was 6. And so we changed their diets, changed their environment. And now they're 15, 14, and 11. And they've had one antibiotic in their life between the three of them. And there's been no cavities between the three of them. And that's, yes, we do supplements. Yes, we do cool stuff. But the large foundation for all of that is our diets. Not all the fancy, cool, blue lip muzzle extract or whatever. It's like just good old fashioned real food, in moderation. Because Michael Pollan says real food in moderation, mostly plants. And a lot of that stuff I got from Weston A. Price's research on nutrition and infectious diseases from back in the 1940s and 50s. So again, a lot of this is not new.
And, the adage of you are what you eat, it's true. And I love to work out. I've worked out since I was 17 years old religiously. And every trainer I've ever worked with in my life has said if it's a choice between exercise or eating properly, you always choose eating properly.
True.
If you have to make a choice. It's
crazy to think about, but, I don't want to say diet's more important than exercise, but if you were to pick one thing to do well, it's going to be diet. I agree 100% with that.
And I used to, when I was younger, not agree with it. And then the older I get and the more I realize how much the quality of the food I'm eating matters, right? If I'm going to eat a French fry or if I'm going to eat quinoa, the quinoa is going to do better for me in the long run than the French fry, although the French fry occasionally tastes incredible. So I think what you're saying is that if we're going to party and have special foods, that we need to go back to a staple of solid nutritional food.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We're nearly out of time, and I want to just circle the conversation to an area that is very sensitive, and that is how COVID, long COVID, and healthcare in general have become so politicized. And I'd love your take on this because you have your hands in every pot, right? Functional medicine, integrative medicine, preventative medicine. You're doing research, clinical trial research with pharma, and you're everywhere. And what have you learned and what can you share to help us make better and informed decisions about what we choose to do for our health and the health of our family?
I mean, I think, it's the difficult thing with me in this situation has just been getting patients like good quality information. The first interview I did, because my research site has been involved with the Pfizer trials, and we're one of the top 10 sites in the world actually with Pfizer on this. So love me, hate me, that's kind of like where my research company is. And so when I did my first interview with our local news station, they misrepresented like my situation. They said I made the vaccine. And it's like, I'm just a clinical researcher. I had nothing to do with the development. That's like decades, right? And the light bulb went off my head, like, wow, this is how bad things were. And then as I did interview after interview, like what I was saying was kind of, I have an interview and like the actual broadcast wouldn't be actually what I was trying to communicate. And it got to the point where I was like, doing social media things. And mid last summer, one of the articles that came out of the the British Medical Journal was that air quality affected severity of COVID. I'm like, well, that makes sense. Wuhan province, Lombardy, Italy. These are industrial centers, London, New York. And there's a lot of microparticulates. And this is one of the reasons I make a big deal about air quality. And there's literature showing that air quality affected severity of COVID. So I was like, hey, HEPA filters, like that's not a big deal.
Right.
And Facebook said it was political speech because I said pollution and COVID. And so I wasn't able to actually push out that Facebook post. And I kind of was like, okay, this is an uphill battle. And I kind of realized like if me as a clinical researcher, if I can't talk about this freely and discuss this, who's actually getting the ability to talk about it? And ultimately it comes out to this whole thing, this idea of social proofing. If you've been accepted by your peers or the social media, now you are an authority regardless of your background. And some of my patients coming to me and say, well, I heard on Michael Howard Stern's thing about XYZ. I'm kind of thinking I can't compete with that, so I just kind of realized that it's just hard to get information, and what's out there, it's the Wild West.
Well, come and talk about this anytime here, because I find it very difficult to wade through all the nonsense that's out there. And I welcome facts, even if they're facts that don't align with my thinking. I'm okay with that because it allows for a good conversation, and I can learn, and our listeners can learn.
Well, there's things now that I use in my practice that I kind of poo-pooed 5 and 10 years ago. And I think that's the reason we call the practice of medicine the practice, because we're always learning. And this whole idea that science is this solid thing that doesn't change and doesn't move, I'm kind of like, then you don't know the history. I tell people it took 50 years and 7,000 research articles, before the Surgeon General of the United States said smoking causes cancer. In the 1970s, the American Medical Association was saying, hey, this is controversial. Okay, let's go back to the 1500s in China. In the 1500s, when smoking was entering into China, they actually actively saw it was hurting their military, it was hurting their citizens, and were trying to push out this Western influence in their country. Like they knew almost half a millennia ago, smoking's bad for you. Like, why did it take us so long? And that's where I feel like, this idea that, well, where's the research article that shows you this? I'm like, if you're looking for that, then you're going to be looking a long time before you actually even make any action or prevention.
Yeah. Well, we can't forget common sense as part of the ingredient here, critical thinking and common sense. And we probably should leave it at that at the moment and then have another conversation.
Yeah.
Oh, my. Thank you, Dr. Aaron Hartman. This has been a pleasure for me, and I appreciate your work and your message. To learn more about Dr. Hartman's work, please visit richmondfunctionalmedicine.com, on Twitter at Aaron Hartman, MD, and on Facebook and Instagram, RVA Integrative. And I also want to mention that Dr. Hartman has a free ebook on his website that is a roadmap to resilience that is filled with information that is relevant to this conversation today. Aaron, come and hang out again. Seriously.
Hey, I enjoyed it. I'd love to come back again if you invite me and we can talk about something else.
You're invited.
There we go.
Here comes that break. We'll be right back.
Did you know that happiness is actually good for your health? Happy people live longer, are more productive, and make better partners, parents, and professionals. Connect with us on Facebook at Harvesting Happiness, and follow Lisa on Twitter at Lisa Kamen for a daily dose of inspiration.
This episode was recorded while on the road, and you know what that means. Imperfect sound, imperfect technology, but still that perfect, health-consciously prepared brain food. And we're back. We're talking about winterizing our health, preventing and managing colds, COVID, and more. My next guest is Dr. Neil Schacther, who is one of the leading authorities on respiratory disease in the United States. He serves as professor of medicine and community medicine at the Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York City. Dr. Schacther has served as president of the American Lung Association of the City of New York, the Connecticut Thoracic Society, and the National Association of Medical Directors of Respiratory Care. He is the author of The Good Doctor's Guide to Colds and Flu, How to Prevent and Treat Colds, Flu, Sinusitis, Bronchitis, Strep Throat, and Pneumonia at any age. Whew. Welcome, Dr. Schacther. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, this is part of human happiness, how to keep ourselves bulletproofed or well-armed in fighting these germs. Talk to us about the cold wars.
Well, colds represent probably the most common infections that people, certainly in the United States, are faced with. There are probably about 1 billion colds every year. Most people, on average, get 2 colds a year. Children get many more, and seniors get somewhat fewer. The reason for that is that there are over 200 viruses, 200 different viruses, which cause the common cold with its symptoms. And these colds are independent one of the other. In other words, once our immune system knows how to fight one, it's still vulnerable to the others. Eventually, by the time you reach 50s, 60s, your body has met enough colds so that you're not getting a cold every month as your child would, or even once every 6 months as you would as an adult.
Let me ask you something about the common colds and influenza as it relates to the era of COVID, because I have a friend who is an ER doctor in Manhattan, and she was telling me that they saw no influenza come into the ER. Lots of chest pains and anxiety attacks, but no influenza during COVID.
Right. That's a very interesting phenomenon. And it's not only here in the United States, it's worldwide. And we think the reason for that are the protections that have been established for protecting ourselves against the new COVID pandemic. The masks, the isolation, the lockdown, the hand sanitization, at least initially, all these things are things that we knew protected us against colds and flu, but we never really practiced them to any serious extent. With COVID, they became the order of the day. And as a result, as your friend noted, there have been practically no colds and certainly no flu virtually no flu hospitalizations or deaths in this past year. This probably will change in the coming year as the COVID pandemic subsides.
It is fascinating to me because the correlation of, cause and effect of why colds went down makes perfect sense. And for myself, I'm thinking, well, I think I'm a champion for the mask now, like going out in public, particularly in the winter and on planes, because it seems to do the trick of keeping my germs to myself and others' germs to themselves.
It's a very simple procedure for a very complicated disease. So, yes, do the simple things first.
So let's talk about the comeback of the cold, because I have noticed with family members and friends living around the country and around the world that I'm hearing reports of, oh, I just have a common cold. I went and I got tested for COVID. It's negative, and it's 2-3 days. I'm out of commission and I'm back in action. Talk a little bit about that and what is known about the return of the cold.
Well, first of all, it's a good thing to sort of describe what the difference is between colds, flu, COVID, and other respiratory problems like allergies are. There is a similarity between colds and allergies, just as there is a similarity between the flu and COVID. The symptoms are very similar, but between the two, there is a marked distinction. And I like to talk about the next sign. For colds and allergies, for usual respiratory infections, colds, the symptoms are primarily above the neck. The eyes get watery, irritated, the nose gets stuffy, it's hard to breathe through your nose, you get a sore throat, you may feel a little bit sick, but you're pretty much able to get around and do the activities that you need to do. If you're a student, you go to school. If you're in business, you go to your job. This is not the case for the flu, or certainly for COVID. Those are much more generalized diseases. They affect the entire body. And so many of the symptoms that you get are from the neck down. Fever, which is a generalized symptom, aches that are muscle spasms throughout the body, joint pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. All these things are associated with the flu and with COVID. One interesting set of symptoms that we have with COVID that has come to a lot of people's attention is the loss of taste and smell. And we think that particular symptom is due to the fact that the COVID virus, as it is a virus that attacks throughout the body, it's not just limited to the respiratory tract as colds are, or even the flu to some extent, but it attacks the nerves, and in particular the nerves that tell us what the taste of your food is and what the smell of different odors in your environment are. Fortunately, those two particular symptoms come back with time in virtually all cases, and you're able to enjoy food and unfortunately also put on the weight that you lost as a result of your illness.
So when we talk about the common cold, we talk about a little bit about COVID. Let's move to a couple other conditions that people might not be as familiar with, and that is sinusitis and bronchitis.
Well, so sinusitis, a very frequent complication of the common cold. You have to understand that the whole respiratory tract is just one open series of chambers. The sinuses are these cavities within your skull. You have one above each of your eyes. You've got one in each cheek. You've got some behind the nose. These are air pockets within the skull, and they serve a very useful purpose. They lighten the weight of your skull. If your skull was pure bone, it would be heavy enough that every once in a while you'd have to put your head down on your shoulder to relax the muscles that are keeping it afloat. Now, with those air chambers, there has to be a communication with the back of your throat in order for any mucus or dust that gets into those sinuses to be able to be evacuated. So this is the route through which colds migrate to the sinuses and give you sinusitis as a result of the cold. They also give you sinusitis as a result of allergy, because the sinuses are very frequently affected by allergic reactions to inhaled pollution or pollen or mold. And so they become clogged with mucus. In the case of a cold, and in the case of allergy, the excess mucus is evacuated through these narrow channels that connect the sinuses to the back of your throat. And that's what gives you the phenomenon of post-nasal drip, among other things. So sinusitis is just one particular phenomenon in the upper respiratory tract. As an infection moves down into the lower respiratory tract, then the tubes, the airway tubes, beginning with the windpipe, which is that solid structure that you feel when you put your hand on the front of your neck, that becomes affected by infection or by allergy, and it can become inflamed, produce mucus, and cause you to cough and have a little bit of shortness of breath. All those things are part of the infection that make up upper respiratory tract infections. And eventually, as an infection moves down into the lower respiratory tract, such as with the flu or with COVID or with what we call pneumonia, then other symptoms appear. You still get cough, but you also get a shortness of breath and potentially chest pain.
And is this bronchitis? Is this part of? So
bronchitis is just inflammation of the air tubes at or below the neck. Your throat is a combined passageway. One channel leads to your stomach, and the other passageway leads to your two lungs. And fortunately, there's a little manhole cover that closes automatically every time you swallow so that food doesn't go down the wrong channel. But when you're not swallowing, that manhole cover remains open and allows air to move in and out of your lungs. So when the first tube, the trachea or the windpipe gets infected, it becomes tracheitis. When the branches of that tube, which go to the right and to the left lung, which are known as bronchi, get infected, that's known as bronchitis. When the tiniest airways all the way down in the passageways, which are called bronchioles, get infected, that is called bronchiolitis. And finally, when the little air sacs at the end of this branching system get infected, that's what we call pneumonia.
Fascinating. Thanks for breaking it down and taking us through the respiratory system and all the different areas that are affected. We're going to need to take a break. And when we come back, we are going to dive into some of the remedies and how we can help ourselves to treat and heal from these common ailments. We are going to take that pause to learn more about Dr. Neil Schacther. Please go to thegooddoctor1.com. And that's the good doctor and the number 1.com. Here comes the pause. We'll be right back. And that is a promise.
Who says money can't buy happiness? Whether you are a skeptic or seeker, check out Lisa's new book. Are we happy yet? 8 Keys to Unlocking a Joyful Life. A boot camp manual for greater emotional fitness is available at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, IndieBound, and HarvestingHappiness.com. Here's a truth bomb. Emotions are contagious, and happiness is a universally desired state. But we tend to forget that we all have the freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable each day, regardless of external circumstances. Explore the journey of human happiness, how to find it and keep it, with Lisa's documentary film, H Factor. Where is your heart? Visit HarvestingHappiness.com to learn more.
This episode was recorded while on the road, and you know what that means. Imperfect sound, imperfect technology, but still that perfect, health-consciously prepared brain food. And we're back talking with Dr. Neil Schacther about winterizing our health, preventing and managing colds, COVID, and more. Let's get back to it. So, Dr. Schacther, let's talk about, how to care for ourselves, the remedies and prevention, controversy and effectiveness of some of the treatments out there.
Right. Well, as with any illness, not getting the illness is the best way of treating it. So,
right. Prevention.
Prevention is the first step in any process where you protect yourself. And you can protect yourself with technology. In other words, not so much technology at this stage, but simple measures such as preventing the germ from entering the part of your body that is affected. And that's why masks are effective, because for the most part, these illnesses, these respiratory illnesses, are carried by little droplets that people spew out when they cough, when they sneeze, or even when they talk. And these little droplets, which are microscopic, can be inhaled and work their way down into the different parts of the respiratory tract. As we said, the sinuses, the nasal passages, the throat, the airways, and eventually even the little sacs at the end of those airways, and give you the kinds of reaction that end in itis, such as sinusitis or bronchitis.
So number one, hang on one sec. So number one line of defense, follow the science, wear the mask. Good idea.
wear a mask. And if you know that someone is infected, and I go back to the old Bert and Ernie routine from Sesame Street, where I forget whether it's Bert or Ernie that has the cold, recognize the symptoms of a cold. And if somebody has symptoms, if they're coughing, sneezing, or they look sick, then, step back, keep your distance. 3 to 6 feet is usually recommended, because that's how far those little tiny droplets can travel when you sneeze or cough. So there are 5 major ways to boost your immune system. One is to stop smoking. Smoking has a deleterious effect on the airway clearance, the ability to get rid of germs. Drink with moderation, because alcohol has the same effect. Obesity is another one that depresses the immune system. And if you can lose weight, that will tone up your immune system. Good nutrition, staying fit, eating a healthy diet keeps your immune system alert and active. And finally, exercise. It's known that exercise promotes the cells that help you fight off infections. So all these 5 simple things, or maybe they're simple, are things that protect you even before you get infected. Once you get infected, there are a number of non-specific things that you can do, or that people have suggested that you do. Among them, vitamin C in moderate doses, 250 to 500 milligrams a day. Zinc is another protective mechanism. Steaming and washing out your sinuses with saline, another protective mechanism.
Well, that's a good one.
Yeah. Doing it twice a day, once in the morning, once at night. And you don't have to use very large quantities of nasal saline. Just get one of these little squeegee bottles that you find in every drugstore that's labeled nasal saline. So those are some of the simple things that you can do early on to not necessarily treat and cure a cold, but to shorten the duration and make some of the symptoms less intense. Now, for the common cold, unfortunately, we don't have specific treatments. As I mentioned earlier, there are over 200 viruses that cause these colds, and they are very different one from the other. And there's no overall regimen or pharmaceutical that can address them at this point in time.
What about the importance of bed rest and sunshine?
Right.
And being out in nature, and you spoke about exercise, but the idea of having a cardio type exercise to keep the lungs clear.
Yeah, I'm not talking about doing heavy duty exercise. I'm talking about walking a half an hour a day, doing your 5,000 steps, keeping fit, that sort of thing. As to what were some of the other things you were questioning?
Sunshine, getting a little bit of sun, being out in nature.
Sunshine promotes production of vitamin D, and vitamin D has been associated with improved immune function. So that's certainly a good thing. Fresh air, again, being indoors in the wintertime is a recipe for being exposed to viruses and other germs that will cause infections. So being outdoors, as we've realized with the COVID pandemic, safer than being indoors.
And what about good old-fashioned chicken soup, which almost every culture has a recipe for one?
Well, there are actually some studies which show that chicken soup may have some beneficial activity in the common cold. And this relates to some of the fumes that are given off that help liquefy the mucus that accumulates in these infections and allows you to get rid of infected material more easily.
So there's a lot that we can do to prevent and take care of ourselves if we do get infected. Right.
Now, for the flu and for COVID now, vaccination, probably the surest thing, not necessarily for totally preventing infection with COVID, because people who are vaccinated still can get very mild cases of the flu, but protecting us from some of the very serious complications of the flu and certainly the very serious and often fatal complications of COVID. Just to give you some idea of the relative intensity of these diseases, in the worst case scenario year, the flu kills about 20 to 60,000 Americans. In the first season of COVID, we have over now 700,000 Americans who have died, more than 10 times the fatality rate. So it makes absolute sense to protect yourself against that specific complication, which the flu vaccine does do.
So the bottom line...
And the COVID vaccine.
Sorry. Yes. So I just want to because we've run out of time, and I want to make sure that we give a recap here, that at the bottom line is that, follow the science, preventative measures, vaccination to prevent extreme complications of both influenza and COVID. Not that it will prevent you from getting them. It will lessen the effects and likelihood of death
and hospitalization.
Yes, which is definitely something that all of us, I believe, want to prevent. My guest today has been Dr. Neil Schacther. He is the author of The Doctor's Guide to Colds and Flu, How to Prevent and Treat Colds, Flu, Sinusitis, Bronchitis, Strep Throat, Pneumonia, and COVID at any age. This is an updated edition of a book that came out many years ago, but there is now a 2021 version of it that has all the latest science. To learn more, please visit thegooddoctor1.com. Once again, that's thegooddoctor with the number 1.com. My guest once again has been Dr. Neil Schacther. Thanks so much, Dr. Schacther.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen and my guests, Dr. Aaron Hartman and Dr. Neil Schacther, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Please go out and rock your day and remember to be kind to one another.
Keep harvesting your own happiness anytime and anywhere, from the comfort of wherever you are. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes via our free app or from our libraries at toginet.com, iTunes, Google Play, and other fine podcast platforms. To learn more about Lisa's global consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Spread more joy by liking us on Facebook at Harvesting Happiness and following Lisa on Twitter at Lisa Kamen. Harvesting Happiness is produced in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU Radio Malibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.